In this video, we're going to take a look at Organic Studio's Neon Red Orange. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. There is so much good and only one bad about this ink. Okay, maybe two bad. First bad is the name. This may get people to shy away from it out of fear of basically having an incredibly bright color on the page. Second, and this is really just for me, it's the kind of orange-leaning red that I just don't go for a bunch, or almost ever, but it is really good. Everything about its performance is good, especially how well it does on non-fountain pen friendly paper. Now, there's almost no tone variation by pen. Of course, we're talking about on just the same paper. It does change tone when you change papers. I'll say it doesn't shade, though when you see it, you will see some light spots of some darker areas. Not really shading, though. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Parker Jotter with a medium nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get a pretty decent tone of red. Like I said, there's just a little bit of an orange lean to it, which just doesn't make this really the red for me. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading, though, like I said, you can see a couple of spots which are a little bit darker in there, but I'm not really looking at that as shading here. Looking at the broad nib, it is roughly the same tone that we had with the fine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. Here we are getting some shading, so I said it doesn't really shade because this is pretty much the only time we're going to see it. And you can really see it at the second D of did, and in the word announce, and in the word the. Quite a bit here you do see that. Now, if you're like me in this way, I don't prefer my reds to shade. Looking at the stub nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the broad. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. Because it's performing very much the same way, we do get a couple of spots that you could call some shading. But this is the Clairfontaine paper, and this is a stub that if an ink can shade, normally they'll bring it out. But it's only there a little bit and not consistently. I'll only say that the word number comes up lighter than everything else around, but not really shading much here. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Lamy All-Star with a fine nib. A Lamy All-Star with a broad nib. A Lamy Safari with a 1.1 stub. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the fine nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get no shading, but a couple of spots that are a little bit darker. As I said, it doesn't really shade, but you do get that little bit of light here, or light speckling of color, some darker colors every now and then. Really? So there is a little bit. I feel like I'm going to be really regretting the no shade comment in my overview. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little darker than we had with the fine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it actually is shading fairly well, where we see it getting darker and lighter, or lighter and darker in individual words. Just look at himself. Look at Prince. You'll see that it's definitely there, the word able on the 4th line. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the broad. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does have that little bit of shading. It's not what's there isn't as obvious as it was with the broad, but there is just the slightest bit of it. I just don't think this is if this was photography, we'd be pixel peeping. I think we can go after some spots that are a little bit darker, a little lighter, but you're chasing it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily write back here. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get slightly lighter in tone than we had with the Clairfontaine, only slightly lighter. It's not feathering, which I'm a little surprised, but happy surprised. It's not spreading. It's not shading. It is showing a little bit more of that orange lean, so while it's very much the same tone, it's the tone of the paper is bringing out that orange lean. Looking at the broad nib, we get slightly darker than we had with the fine. It does feather, tiny little feathers the entire time, especially just look at and that's the sound that was made as the very first word, top line. You see tiny feathers all over it, and there is the slightest bit of spread. However, with that, it's doing, I think, pretty good considering this is not made for fountain pens. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the broad. We do get tiny feathers. We do get a tiny bit of spread. Both the feather and the spread are absolutely manageable here. It's not something that you have to write ginormous to avoid or super fast to try to avoid or cut down on. Not at all. We're not getting any shading, and we're still getting that slightly towards orange lean of it. You see the orange in this red now. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily write back here. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get just a little bit lighter than the tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get a light amount of shading that is occurring here, but you really are searching for it. I think you notice it more at the end of the third line and end of the fourth line than you do anywhere else. So I won't call it shading, though you can find it. Looking at the broad nib, we see it's quite a bit darker than we had with the fine. It's actually a little bit darker than what we mostly got on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather. We get no spread. We do get a little bit of shading. You're going to see it on crystallograph. I hope I said that correct. On the third line, it's the only word on the third line. You're going to see it on electricity in the fourth line. There is a little bit of it, and it's not horrible in how it looks. It's just not for me. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone as the broad. It doesn't feather. It doesn't spread. It largely doesn't shade. We've got only the end of possibility on the first line that really is showing some shading happening, but everywhere else it's a pretty uniform tone and looks good on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we have only the minor bit of ghosting, really none to worry about. You can easily write back here, and none of it touched the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Birmingham Pen Company Duquesne Incline Station Red. Here is Colorverse Mars Curiosity. Here is J. Herbin Rouge Bourgogne. Here is Robert Auster Direct Sun. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it is close to the tone of the last paper, and it's weird because it's not orange and it's not red, but it definitely kind of looks like the name is working quite right here in its color. It does feather, it does spread, it does not shade. I actually think it looks pretty interesting as a color because you get confused about what it is. Looking at the broad nib, it is a bit darker than what we had with the fine, though the same color, just in darker tone. It does feather, it does spread, it does not shade. However, from the third to fourth line, when the P and the L cross, you do see it get a little bit darker. Or from the fourth to the fifth line, the Y and the I cross, it gets a little darker, which says, I guess it could shade. I just hope it doesn't bleed. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the broad. It does feather. It does shade. Shade? Wrong thing. No, it does not shade. It does spread. It does not shade. Whew. So, yes, feather. Yes, spread. No, shade. Same tone. You could use it if you wanted to. I don't know that I would. Nothing bled through and touched the page underneath, which was absolutely fantastic, especially looking at the back of the page when you see just how much ghosting there is, because you can't write back here. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue-black ink by Califolio Bacal. Here is a gray ink by Diatramentis, their Fog Gray. Here is a blue ink by Mont Blanc, Permanent Blue. Here is a black ink by Sailor, their Gentle Black. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib. It is the same tone that we kind of got with that last paper. It does feather. It does spread. Both the feather and the spread are pretty manageable for what's going on here. I mean, this is a fine that looks like a broad, but it's not the end of the world. It's not shading. I think this is pretty good in how it's looking. Looking at the broad nib, we get the same tone that we had with the fine. It does feather. It does spread to some huge, like triple broad. I mean, it spreads a lot. But you can read it and you can see it. So that's not the end of the world. It's not shading, which is good news when we think about how this could work for the bleed through. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the fine. It does feather. It does spread. It does not shade, although I will point out that the very first letter in known, that K is, I almost said canone because I was thinking of the K. In the first K in known is a bit darker than everything else that's there. The good news is, without shading, we likely don't have bleed. Looking at the page underneath, we see that there were 3 bleed spots on the stub and the stub only. When we see the back of the page, there is plenty of ghosting, but at least it's not bleeding through with the fine or the broad. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? This ink is without a doubt a dealer's choice. But since personally I would really use this more for editing in things I write or adding additional notes to my writing, I see putting this more in a medium flow, a fine nib. I think the color that's here is very interesting. It looks nice on the page, though admittedly, it's not the tone that I would normally go for, but I will happily use the end of this vial up. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to support the channel, you can over on Patreon. Thanks for watching.